you could comment a little more about U.S. reaction to China's role outside of Asia. I was thinking particularly, to confess it is Asian, of Iran, of Syria, of other world crises that the U.S. has to grapple with.
We can hold this for a while, and Bob will synthesize and give a collective response, or comprehensive response, I guess.
I'm not Harry Hardy.
You'll do great. Any more questions or comments? Yeah, Gail?
This is also for Bob. It's not really a question as much as a comment. I like the sort of where you come at the end in terms of a relatively optimistic view of the relationship, and I agree with the idea that these trade ties, economic engagement can bind these states. The one concern I had in the overall tone of the paper, I suppose, is this. I guess this feeling I had from reading the paper that this new assertiveness that China supposedly is exhibiting now. You nicely say that it's not as the relationship with the U.S. is not as bad as it was when the Taiwan Straits crisis was re-emerging in the mid-90s. But the tone I get from the paper is somehow that China has adopted this new sort of bullying attitude towards the region, and I might be able to accept some of that for the South China Sea, although there I might take a more defensive position for China anyways. But regarding the Senkaku Islands and the dispute with Japan, my view on this one is very simply that China is responding to Japan's attempt to change the status quo. And it's, if you think about the sequencing here, these little islands that don't seem to have any direct value except perhaps oil underneath them or around them. The Tokyo government, for nationalistic reasons, as I understand it, decides to take them over, buy them. And then the Japanese government, for largely nationalistic reasons, decides to take them from the Tokyo government.
The Chinese government?
No, the Tokyo government buys these islands, as I understand the sequencing, and then the Japanese government decides, hey, Tokyo can't have them, that doesn't sound right, we'll take them. And so when China is reasserting itself regarding these islands, the whole crisis since 2012 and so forth, that to me is a defensive reaction rather than a new assertiveness that seems to show China's got this power that it wants to bully states around with. My view is look, status quo is just fine. Keep these things ambiguous. We won't push it. You don't push it. And then Japan, I could think for largely nationalistic reasons, decides to change the status quo. Regarding the South China Sea, which is the other one that everyone points to, okay, I can see that China with its 9 or 11 dash line is being rather assertive, if you will, in terms of its claims. But I think there as well, they would prefer, especially given the potential negative spin-off effects with the U.S. relationship, they would prefer to see a largely cooperative solution. But we have to say that, the Philippines and the Vietnamese and so forth have not been necessarily just, sitting back. They've also been quite assertive regarding their claims. And again, I'm maybe painting the opposite picture just to be provocative, but I think the paper comes across as being not only not explaining why there's this shift to this new assertiveness, but just this new assertiveness seems to come out of nowhere because now China is this dominant Asian power, at least has a new sense of its own power. I see China as wanting the status quo, which I think you largely agree with, and being reactive when it has to be.
I wanted to ask both Bob and me two questions related. It's interesting that in a way, in both of your papers, you spend a lot of time talking about China's relations with Asia. And Bob characterized China as being constrained in Asia. But it wasn't quite clear to me, you talk about the way your paper's structured, you talk about sort of U.S. relations with China, and then you bring these sort of relations with Asia, and you say that China's relations with Asia constrain its relations with the U.S., but I'd like to hear a little bit more about why and how that happens, okay? Second thing, just related, is I'm interested in, I think Dale and I agree China's on the rise, okay? But I'm wondering what that means for Asia, So you have China, and you mentioned China's relations with Korea. We could talk about China's relations with Japan. We could talk about China's relations with ASEAN countries, for instance. We might even talk about China's relations with India. I think we'll do that later this afternoon. But what does China's rise, I mean, if this is a broad question, but what does China's rise mean? Does it mean that these other countries will fall into what, a flying geese pattern, or you know, I mean, or how, what is the pattern likely to be? And here we go back to sort of the whole issue of sort of, I mean, the way I understand sort of Dale's sort of point is it's more of a China rising as a pole and the other countries are going to sort of fall in, as opposed to sort of having a more sort of autonomous, sort of different region, et cetera. So I'd be interested in hearing.
Let me ask each of the presenters a question of my own, and then we'll turn it back to them. And each question has to do with a distinction that they make either in an oral presentation or their written paper that I would like to have them clarify a little bit. Shishong, in your presentation, you said that the relationship between, one of the reasons for your relative optimism is that the relationship between China and the United States is becoming more interest-driven. I assume you mean as opposed to values-driven. And yet, do not countries often identify the promotion or defense of values as an interest? So in other words, I'm trying to understand what that distinction is. And interest can also, even if they're more material, can conflict quite sharply. So could you explain a little bit further as to how you see a more interest-driven relationship as being different from something else? For Bob, it's the distinction that I already alluded to in turning things over to Guanyi. You make a distinction in your paper between confronting and challenging. You say China will not confront the United States, but it will increasingly challenge it. Could you explain the distinction? That seems like an important distinction. Can you define it a little more precisely? So let's go back to Shishong first for about very briefly 5 minutes, and then to Bob, and then we have to break.
Okay, I'll just say a few words about the first question is how does China look at U.S. presence in Asia? I think a big change in this regard took place in 2011 when Hu Jintao visited the United States. Both sides reached consensus and issued a joint statement in which both sides agree that the United States welcomes rising, prosperous, stable China, and in return, China welcomes the United States. First time that in the joint statement said the United States is an Asian Pacific country. So welcome the United States as an Asian Pacific country to play a more constructive and positive role in maintaining security and stability in Asia Pacific region. So this is the first time that China, in an open way, emphasized that China welcomed the United States to play. So I don't think that China opposes U.S. presence want to drive the United States away, driving away from Asia. That's not the case. Both countries pay attention to the importance of Asia, and the point is how to coordinate and cooperate while retaining differences. Not much time to elaborate. And as to interest-driven, for a quite long period of time that China did not mention interest, only values, ideologies. And the Deng Xiaoping came out and said, no, we have to surpass that stage. We should surpass ideological differences in the values, and we should find common interests, and upon which to further improve our relationship. So here, I think, driven interest does not include the value. So now, more of that focus on so-called core interests, major concerns. And then what are the core interests of the United States? We're not very clear about it. And what the core interests of China, right? So there's still some problems for both countries market to get to know much better the core interests and the major concerns.
We'll stop there if you don't mind, Mr. Short.
Okay,
Thank you
so-
very much for the clarification on both of these points. Bob?
It's a bit of a list, so just bear with me. On Professor Cilio's questions, what causes the back and forth in China's approach? Of course, we don't know, but there is back and forth. And I see the back and forth as caused by a major contradiction. On the one hand, the Chinese administration very much wants peace and stability in the region. The peace and development is what they emphasize. And yet they have these sovereignty and territorial issues that get in the way. And these sovereignty and territorial issues at various times become very prominent. They come to the very top of the Chinese priority list, as they are today. And Taiwan, of course, is another one of these. And that leads them to take assertive actions to deal with these things at various times. Mischief Reef, back in 1995, the Taiwan Strait crisis, and so forth. And it complicates their relationships. And so I think I have a quote from Li Keqiang. He says, it's not a contradiction. Well, it is a contradiction. It's a fundamental contradiction which is very difficult to resolve. I'm not sure it's related to leadership succession. I don't know. On the economic decline and nationalistic impact, I don't think it's going to decline that much, I guess. So I haven't really addressed this issue. I haven't thought about this issue very much. Obviously, if it really declines economically, we have a very uncertain situation. I just don't know what it is. Should the U.S. be sensitive to its military presence and competing with China that exacerbates China's sense of insecurity? I guess we should. But the bottom line here, even if we don't want to, the other countries of Asia are very sensitive to this. And so your policy isn't going to work if you cause big tensions in U.S.-China relations. Then you'll alienate all your friends in Asia. And so the rebalance and other policies are premised on two things. On the one hand, you have to be in a position where you can deter China, at least get it to cooperate more and not be doing the assertive things that unnerve the neighbors and contrary to the United States, and at the same time keep a stable relationship because you manage that relationship in a way that doesn't cause real instability in Asia, which would alienate other neighbors as well. So whether we should look at China that way is irrelevant in that sense. It's really, if you want to make your policy work, it has to have the cooperation of all the Southeast Asian countries and Japan and Korea and so forth. The role of middle powers, and this is the scenario that plays out of real danger in U.S.-China relations is that Japan will take some action, this type of thing. It's always been there, and it could happen, and we had Chen Shui-bian back in 2000 to 2008, and that was a real problem, and so yes, that has to be managed. On Howie's question on U.S. reaction to China's role outside of Asia, this is where the cheap rider comes in. They just don't help, and they're just not a lot of help. And they use the system in various ways, and they have a very narrow wind set. And so it's not that they're opposed to the United States. It's just that don't expect much in that regard. And Dale and China's bullying in the region and so forth. We need to look at, this is being investigated, the state of play of Japanese decision-making. Keep in mind, this is Noda. This isn't Abe that made this decision.
Correct.
And Noda, he didn't want trouble with China. And so when the Tokyo government wanted to take over these islands, he said, we got to stop this. And we don't have much time. So what the devil do we do? So they had to figure out something to do. So, to me, this was a very damage-limiting type of thing. But we don't have authoritative assessments of Noda's decision-making on this thing. And then you get the Chinese reaction. Think about this. This made a big impression on me, and I'm weird this way, I guess. In 120 cities in China, you had mass demonstrations where they burned down Japanese car dealerships and so forth, as well as all the other pressures that they put on Japan. This is totally out of line in international norms.
Good point.
This is Benghazi. And that's what they did. On a national scale, with full support, government statement, every standing committee members telling people, show your righteous indignation. And they did. This is outrageous. I just find this is the second power of the world. If the world is going to be run by the country like this, we are in big trouble. And so, to me, why did they do that? Well, to show their righteous indignation. Well, if you're calculating why they do it, to intimidate the hell out of these people. And this is coercive, intimidating practices, and you see this across the board. Now, because they've decided, no more of this, we're going to pounce. If something like this happens, we're going to pounce, and they'll never do it again.
Right.
Okay, so they've taught us all a lesson, just like they invaded Vietnam and taught them a lesson too. And so, anyway, that's, I'm sorry I get a little worked up over that, because I just found that, because the world just gave it a pass. The world say, oh, that doesn't matter. Well, that's Japan, they don't like Japan. 120 cities for a week. Okay, that's enough. And then John, why relations with Asia will constrain China regarding the United States? In other words, the calculus I have is that China is not secure. Are they really about to attack and get into a confrontation with the United States? What would happen? What would India do? What would Russia do? Let's take a close country like Hun Sen. How much more money would China have to give to Hun Sen? And then there's always North Korea. What would they do under these very uncertain circumstances? And China's got this all around the rim. So how do they calculate this? We don't know. But if you look at it, they have to factor it in. And it seems to me it adds uncertainty. And whenever you go to war, if you're a reasonable actor, you try to calculate what's going to happen before you go to war. And there's a lot to calculate here, if you see what I mean. They have no security at all. They have no country they can count on in the entire area. It's not that they're enemies, but they can't count on them. And so, and then the pattern at the end of the paper, I try to get into the dynamics of the region. It's very uncertain. You're dealing with 5 sets of uncertainties. And so what you find is the pervasive view, and this has been going on since the Cold War, is hedging. They hedge. And they're very much focused on themselves and their own calculations, these governments. And so good luck with the pattern. I think this is very hard to define. And Harry, the confrontation means your guns are pointed at you, and your guns are pointed at
military conflict.
Yeah. Right, and as opposed to a challenge. And that would be, something like you're seeing it with the Japanese and the Chinese, something like that.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's time for us to break. I'll leave you with one thought. Thanks to Bob for, maybe it's a term that others have used, it's new to me, the cheap rider. And I take it that that's a slightly more forthcoming version of the free rider. And I'd suggest, being a New Yorker, that this reminds me of the Metropolitan Museum of Art admission policy. Which is basically pay what you can or what you feel like. The suggested admission price is such and such.
$17.
$17. So I thought that they now charge. I'm not sure. I think that they gave up on that, but I'm not sure. I've been there for a while.
Technically, no, but you kind of don't get in until
That's
you
right,
get past
that's right.
the lady
So-
with the $17 sign
That's
on
right.
her
So
head.
we have the same phenomenon with
Guilt.
China. Pay what you want.
This is New York.
Suggested contribution suggested by the United States is X, and then we complain when they pay less than X. Okay, thanks very much for a really, really stimulating session, and time to break.